Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Today on the Focus on Why podcast, I am joined by Andrew Payne. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
It is indeed. And our paths across many a time, almost monthly at the moment, because we've been in a monthly mastermind ever since last October, which is when we first met. That's
right. That's a Speaker Factor competition, which neither of us won, but we weren't bitter about it.
No, not at all. And to be fair, we have really embraced that whole competition in terms of what it's given us, because we've formed a mastermind with, there's pretty much 8 regulars out of the 13, 14 that entered. So the 8 of us meet every month and we talk about our speaker journey. So where are you on your speaker journey? What is it you're doing at the moment?
Well, I guess I'm wearing probably 4 hats at the moment, 2 of which are speaking and 2 of which are sort of, well, they are speaking, but not in a speaking way, if that makes any sense. So my non-speaking hats is I'm a dad to 4. I've got a teenage daughter and 3 boys under 8. So that means, I'm a fashion consultant, a war zone reporter, a triage nurse, a general clown, a cook, and many other things. High pressure negotiator. I also I'm very involved with a charity that works in one of the most deprived areas in Birmingham, and we do like food outreach. We supply free furniture for people when they move from hostel accommodation to tenancy, and we do other things in the community. We've done something really cool actually, which I absolutely love. So we took over what was a Ladbrokes betting shop and turned it into a community centre. And we've now got a Girl Guides meeting there. We've got a local church there. We're doing money mentoring. We're doing a job club. We've got breastfeeding support there, all in this space that was once a Ladbrokes betting shop. And that makes me feel so happy. So that's kind of my second hat, I suppose. And then the other 2 speaking hats, as it were. So I talk a lot about domestic violence and my own experiences of domestic violence in a former marriage. We know that men are also the victims of domestic abuse. I think generally the perception is that the overwhelming majority of victims are in fact female, which is actually quite misleading. And so when I talk about domestic violence, yes, it's about my experiences. Why did I stay? The usual questions, I suppose, that you want to ask. But it's also a bit about the broader face of domestic abuse, parents abused by their own children, which is a rapidly growing phenomenon at the moment, and one that's not very talked about. I talk about gender unity as well. There's a lot of very divisive gender rhetoric around at the moment, which isn't helpful. And then the other speaking hat is I talk around leadership, specifically productivity. So over the next few weeks, I'm delivering to varied associations, institute directors, Federation of Small Businesses, on things around burnout, procrastination, personal performance, critical decision making. So I guess those are my 4 hats, which I juggle to the best of my ability, and which keep me very busy. Sometimes it feels overwhelming. Sometimes I feel like I'm in control. And then sometimes when it's locked down and the kids are at home, then I am out of control, without a question.
So with the hats, where should we start? Which hat would you like to don first?
Where would you like to start? You tell, which hat do you think your audience would most like to hear about, Amy?
Well, we're talking about why you do what you do. We're talking about the focus on why. Yeah. And all of these obviously have a huge focus of why you're doing what they're doing with them. They're not flippant hats that you're switching between.
But so much of it starts, I suppose, the person I am today is quite shaped by my experiences of domestic violence. I don't see myself particularly as a victim. I'm blissfully remarried today. So when I talk about domestic violence, I can talk about it in quite a chipper way, I suppose, because I have come through the other side. But when I think about why I do what I do, So much of what I've learned has come through that. So, some people will say, oh, well, how does an intelligent person fall into an abusive relationship? Surely they were conned. The abuser sort of led them up the garden path, was absolutely lovely. And then just when they got their victim where they want, then they turned, often after the wedding day or whatever it is. But for me, it wasn't like that. My now ex-wife was at the beginning as she was at the end. She was always violent and abusive. But sort of as I came out of that relationship, I realized that one of the reasons I fell into that was I had no real sense of boundaries or who I was. I definitely was a people pleaser. I definitely always believed women to be sort of the fairer, kinder gender, probably had them on a pedestal as well. And all of that together meant that I sort of, when I met my ex-wife, and it was like quite crazy from the beginning, and like suicide attempts and amazing stories, which I believed at the time of abuse as a child and things like that. I just wanted to help her. And as a young man, I mean, today I might think, there might be some red flags here for me as this is all kicking off. But back then, I just wanted to help her, and I had no sense of boundaries. So pretty quickly, I was in this relationship where the violence wasn't every day, but it was pretty bad when it happened. I stabbed with a pencil, candle stick slammed over her head, which is very Agatha Christie kind of a moment, I suppose. And a lot of, when I say sort of shouting and screaming, real nose to nose stuff and threats and all that kind of stuff. And then there's also the emotional stuff that takes place behind that, and the manipulation, which is very common. But in some ways, I allowed myself to sink into that because I was this people pleaser. And so coming out of that, I realized, look, I know I need to get tougher, but I still want to be a nice person. And I really felt, actually, what's lacking here are boundaries. But how do you create boundaries if you don't even have boundaries? And there's an awful lot out there about the importance of boundaries, but nothing about how to create them. So I made up my own sort of kind of model for how to create boundaries, and it worked really well for myself. And I started to share that through the work that I was doing. So my passion, I suppose, for talking about domestic violence, my passion for leadership, my passion for standing up for people moving out of hostel accommodation, moving to tenancy, a lot of that is shaped really by coming out of that relationship. I lost everything when I came out of that relationship. The difference between me, I suppose, and an alcoholic is that I had a loving family to help me pick up the pieces. So I had something. But I lost my house, my business, because my when the marriage ended, it coincided with the recession at the time. As with often happens with abusive relationships, I didn't see a lot of my kids. I had to really fight hard for that in the family courts, and I was in such a low place. But experiencing my family standing by me and really kind of rebuilding has given me a passion for people that are disadvantaged. So in a way, it all starts there in that abusive marriage. Everything I do now is shaped by that, but I'm not that person at the same time, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And you talk about how at the start you just wanted to help her, and that's what you're continuing to do now. It's just you part of who you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we all, and it's so important, I think, even through the pandemic, when we help people, we genuinely know we're making an impact in someone's life. It makes such a difference. And I see this, in the charity that I work for, where we, as I mentioned, the community centre and the food outreach, the furniture outreach. I work with a lot of long-term unemployed and and socially isolated people. And part of what we try and do, as well as our public services, is to give them employability skills, give them really meaningful volunteering experience. And quite often they're a bit sort of dubious about volunteering, and quite often they don't get out. They live a very narrow life where really they want benefits at home. But once they start getting out and helping people and getting involved and actually feel like they can see they're making a difference, seeing how they transform as people is just amazing. It really is. And we all get such a kick out of helping people. And so, and I guess that shapes my work as well with male victims of domestic abuse. I do some stuff privately with male victims of domestic abuse, and it is a difficult situation because you think that no one's going to believe you. You think that the world is stacked against you. There is the whole stigma for male victims of domestic abuse that people are going to just think you're weak. If you allowed yourself to be knocked about, no true man gets knocked about, and all of that stuff goes around your head. There's all the locker room banter of needing a kitchen pass to go out and who wears the trousers. And that's all banter on the one hand, but it creates this sense that men need to be strong and not victims. And I do think that's changing now a bit. I do think there's more awareness out there, but I mean, still in the media, the way they portray domestic abuse is still very much, the stories tend to be from women. Because in order for the national press to report on a story of domestic abuse, they need a secured conviction, and men are less likely to secure convictions for a whole bunch of reasons, fearing being believed, fearing not seeing their kids. And so although we know that a third of victims of domestic abuse are men, that's not reflected in the amount of stories that we're seeing in the media.
And just while we're there, the stories reflecting the reality in the media, and we know that lots of things can get blown out of proportion, and that it's really what sells newspapers is what's at the core here, what's important in the world. So what is it about the fact that, as you say, 1/3 of men are victims that is not getting out there, that is not being covered?
We're not hearing the stories. I think you do, unfortunately. I mean, I don't know about you, but I loathe the Daily Mail and the Sun with an absolute passion, but they will report, funnily enough, on stories of male victims of domestic abuse. And to me, and it sounds terribly judgmental, the more intelligent newspapers won't, and that may be a leaning of the editorial and what they want in their papers and who they're trying to reach out to, I suppose. The conviction thing is a problem. Men generally won't secure convictions, so national press won't report on them for legal reasons, and that's understandable. I think hearing more stories, hearing more about the challenges that men are facing is really important. I think the other thing we have to bear in mind, and I think this is where there's a very misleading portrayal of domestic abuse. 2/3 female. This is with the best of the statistics that we have, and these stats are hotly disputed between male and female groups. But if we say that 2/3 of victims of domestic abuse are female and 1/3 are male, well, some of those females and some of those males will be male on male and female on female. But we know that domestic abuse is rife in the LGBT community. Some of those will be a man and a woman in a relationship that's very healthy, but it's their child that's abusing them. But obviously the man is a victim and the female is a victim as loving parents. And so the breakdown of those stats is harder to define, but we need to bear in mind all phases of domestic abuse, sibling abuse, for example. We need to understand that, yes, if after a football match, there's been a lot of awareness about, domestic abuse going up, that may be true, but it may be true of both genders. It may be true in the LGBT community. So let's portray that as well, so that we're open to it. I know a mum, she's a single mum, and she was being knocked about by her teenage daughters. There's never been a man on the scene there. She adopted them when they were babies. So you can't really blame the patriarchy in that sense, but she feels like a failed parent. She's not a failed parent at all. It's very common, but we don't think it's common because no one's talking about it. So for me, I'm passionate about this broader discussion, not to the detriment of female victims. In the pot for funding, the pot to support victims of domestic abuse is inadequate anyway. But I think we need this broader discussion, so in our workplaces we can best support our colleagues, in our communities, so parents don't feel like failed parents, they feel like they're normal. And actually we can have some open discussions about, why is this has it always been on the rise, or is it just being reported more? We don't really know, is the honest is the honest answer. So that's what I'm passionate about, this broader discussion, and really saying, well, look, whatever the data says, it's okay. So, for example, in Australia, the data seems to suggest that more children are killed by their mothers than their fathers. Now, that is a controversial thing to say. I didn't believe that when I first read it, but I've read about it in a couple of different sources that seem to suggest that's the case. But if that's the case, rather than arguing about it, let's say, okay, well, why might this be happening? Is this linked to postnatal depression? There's the other condition, isn't there? Is it purple psychosis that can cause huge problems? But let's not try and think about our own agenda. Let's just look at the data and have an open conversation that as men and women, let's try and come together and prevent domestic abuse, prevent domestic homicide, and let's get rid of our agendas. That's something I'm passionate about.
It's so difficult, isn't it, to understand how big an issue it is, and unless you've got the data to support it. And as you say, people aren't stepping forward. You're not knowing exactly what the situations are, and then they're not pressing charges. And so to have these broader discussions, what's it going to take to get it out there? It's like that. Whenever there's almost a fame or celebrity moment where something happens, then it gets talked about. But other than that, it just goes below the radar.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And, obviously we've had Johnny Depp and the Amber Heard case. I mean, my own reading of that, for what it's worth, is that when you look at the evidence, it seemed like a fairly mutually dysfunctional relationship when they were pretty nasty to each other. Was one more the aggressor than the other? I wasn't, who's to know? But to me, and I know of a couple where they beat each other up. And that's not a healthy relationship. Is it an abusive relationship? Is it a mutually? It gets complicated. And even with the Caroline Flack, the police, they have a responsibility. If there is a witness of an assault, they have to process that and carry through that prosecute. They're only doing their job. So these stories bring it to light. But I think we need conversations in the workplace. So, for example, how many employees have actually seen what the domestic abuse policy is? How many employees have actually had a conversation with their line managers? Hey, so do we have a policy? If so, what's in it? If so, does that work for us as an organization? What happens if there are allegations? All of this stuff, it just needs to be talked about. And I think it is coming. The more that we are opening up about mental health, and there's this view that it's okay to open up about mental health, then the more that some of the other stuff that causes mental health issues will come to light. And domestic abuse, without a shadow of doubt, has an impact on your mental health. As someone, I can definitely vouch for that. So I think it takes a willingness to have that conversation, a desire to have that conversation, an understanding of how prevalent domestic abuse is, but we misunderstand so much of it.
Yeah, and I guess because everyone's been working from home for the last year or so, or not everyone, but a majority of, a lot of these cases would have been missed as well, because if you had gone into the workplace and had a conversation and someone had spotted that you didn't look okay, then that would have happened. But the fact that people have been able to show up on Zoom and take the camera off and just say, sorry, kids are in the background or something, lots has gone unnoticed. And
it's amazing how quickly domestic abuse can just feel very normal, and then it's not abuse anymore. That's how it feels if you're on the receiving end. It's just kind of like normal life. You justify it. You become your partner's greatest defender and excuse maker. Psychologically, if you're not getting that challenge or that outside contact with other trusted people, you're far less likely to divulge to anyone that you're caught in abuse. It's a much more scary place to be. And it's amazing just how much you just get locked into your own habits. I often talk about in some of the sort of the critical decision making that stuff that I do with business leaders, some of the dilemmas, the mental dilemmas that you get involved with. So even if you know it's bad, you know you're in a difficult relationship, you can see what's going on. This tension between, well, when do I give up and walk away, if I even can? And how long do I keep going for? Being able to navigate that tension, and that spills over, of course, into other areas of our life where the world encourages us to persevere and dig deep. at all costs. But that, unchecked perseverance is dangerous and damaging. And at what point do we choose to pull the plug and invest our energies elsewhere? But for many victims of domestic abuse, one of the problems is even if you wake up and smell the coffee and you think, actually, I need, this is wrong and I am taking action, it's so difficult to make a bold decision when for so long you've been living in fear and lockdown and you're in survival mode. So you're doing whatever it takes to survive. You'd compromise your own integrity if you had to, because it's all about creating stability and peace. And when you live in chaos, all you want is a boring, stable life where everyone just gets on okay. And if that's what you've craved and worked and striven for and strived for, then making a bold decision that requires huge change, you're just very ill-equipped to do that. If once upon a time, if you could have done it after years of abuse, of sort of coping with that, you are less likely to be able to make that bold decision. And so, yeah, if you are in lockdown at home, you're not getting out, then it is very tough for people both to open up or take any kind of action that they need to.
And when did you become decisive, Andrew?
There wasn't a one moment where I became decisive. I sometimes share in the stuff that I do around decision making. So when I didn't take action to leave, I was kicked out. I didn't want to be kicked out. The violence was getting worse. I agreed to go, and I still believed. I was hoping, I didn't want to give up on this. I'd put so much into my marriage, and I hoped that in not living together, there'd be a reset button in somewhere. And I was going to marriage guidance with her, and I was making sure there's enough money in the bank account. I was being a very good boy and doing everything that a good husband would do if he wanted his relationship to repair. But then a couple of months passed, and I was like, actually, I quite like my new life. Like, it wasn't being what I'd have chosen, but I don't come home frightened anymore. I don't come home wondering what's waiting for me. I'd always know if it was going to be really, really bad, because I'd park my car. We were living in France at the time. And as I walked around the corner to the house, if I was walking into a war zone, the dog would be sitting there at the window with its ears flat to its head and its shoulders drooped. But if nothing was going on and there was no storm, his ears would be pointing up. He'd be quite happy to see me. So if ever I saw the dog with the ears flat, I was like, oh no, what's happened? What's happened? You are joking me. So to not come home to that, to not wonder what I was, what version of dog I was going to come home to as the indicator of good or bad, was great. And I started to think, actually, maybe I can, I hate my job. Maybe I can do I started to have ideas. I was like thinking, maybe I'll buy a hotel. I'd be a rotten hotel manager, I'm sure. But because part of my thinking was, how hard can it be to run a hotel? But obviously quite difficult. And they were great ideas, but they were ideas. The first time I had ideas in years. And then my wife suddenly decided she wanted me back. And I could go back home now and move back in as long as I went to counselling. And suddenly I was back into this turmoil. What do I do? Do I go back to what I know? Do I batten down my hatches and just do what everyone would expect me to do? Or do I play bold and carry on and buy a hotel or not and create a new life? And I was in massive turmoil. I did not know what I was going to do. And I was like, I'll go to the mountains for my moments of epiphany. I went to the mountains for a few days. That didn't help. And I was searching for this light bulb moment and realized actually, when you are faced with a difficult decision where the stakes are high, where you've got perhaps a bolder option and a safer option, or an option that you know well and an option that you don't know well, there's always going to be some turmoil. But I realized actually the first thing is you got to work out how much time you have to make your decision, because sometimes you think you don't have much time. There's just people goading you into making a decision to suit their agenda. And I figured, actually, I've got time to make this. I don't need to go straight back. My daughters are, by this point, were used to the coming to daddy's every other weekend. And, I desperately wanted to live with them every day again. But I was like, actually, I'm going to take some time over this. And the second key question is, well, what information do I need? What key data do I need to help me in my decision? And how will I acquire that data? And it became very clear to me that the two game-changing pieces of data was my wife going to take her anger seriously? we were, and I would need to broach this with her whilst I wasn't living with her. And was she going to stop lying? Because I realized that was something that's really bothering me now. I'd sort of turned a blind eye to it before. And so when I broached these in marriage counseling, she stormed out in tears, which I felt wasn't the best start. But, I thought we'll give this some time. But as the month or two passed, it was clear that there was not going to be any progress made. And so logically, as much as it broke my heart not to move back and live with my daughters every day, that was the information I needed. And then there's a decision. You have to make a decision. Do you walk away from the swimming pool, and make it, if you see it as standing by the side of a pool, do you walk away and play it safe, and maybe the pool won't open up to you again? Do you stay on the sides because you need more time, but then be clear about what time, or do you ease your way into that pool and get away and swim? So for me, I decided that there wasn't going to be change. I could see that from the information that I had. It was very clear. So I got into the pool and I moved on. But that whole turmoil that I went through taught me a lot about decision making. And once I'd made that decision, it was amazing then how actually it was still really tough. The main thing was my daughters. That was the hardest thing. But actually, having made a big, bold decision, making other big, bold decisions became a lot easier, and being able to do that well. And I would say as a caveat to that some people think when it comes to critical decision making that we're going to explore how to make very quick decisions and use the guts. For example, it's very trendy, isn't it, to act with your guts. But your guts is a sum of your biases and prejudices and the things that you've experienced. And the things that you've experienced may not actually be what happened. They're just how you remember them. So your gut can be hopelessly flawed. So my view of my gut instinct is it can give me an indicator of a possible direction, but that direction needs to be tested. You need quality data. And actually, yes, if I decide, am I going to clean my teeth or not? That's not a complicated decision. I can decide that straight away. Yes, because I don't want rotten teeth. But for the complex decisions, actually going in with a gut, just a gut feel is not something that I would do, because your gut is a huge gamble, and you need your data anyway. Yeah.
It's fascinating, and it's really interesting to see how, even though all of that was going on, you still wanted it to be resolved. You wanted to be back together. And was that partly because of your daughters, or was it the whole dynamic, the whole family dynamic?
Well, so another dilemma that I mentioned earlier about the never giving up and wake up and smell the coffee. I'm very tenacious as a person. I grew up proper me, and you think about Peter Rabbit on the BBC. I don't know if you watched the Peter Rabbit series, but his motto is a good rabbit never gives up. And there's so much around about not giving up and grit and digging in deep, and Winston Churchill's success is going from one failure to the next without any loss of enthusiasm. And that's all fine. We love a Winston Churchill quote, but that was so in me. I always hung in there to the end. While everyone else had jumped off the ship, I'd still be clinging to the mast, convinced that ship could float if everyone just stayed on it and helped bail the water out. And so part of why I still wanted it to work was that's just me. At that point in my life, I did not believe in giving up. And then when you try at something and you have a hope that something's going to happen, then you fall foul of the narrative bias, where you instinctively try and find evidence to fit your hope, to give you this. There are signs out there, and anything, even if it's a flimsy sign, to you it's this bright light because you want it to work. And any evidence that might come to light that would suggest that the hope isn't going to happen, you'll twist it so it becomes a bright light, or you'll discard it or ignore it if you can't twist it in any way. And so some of the signs at the very end, I remember it was before I'd been kicked out, but I remember my wife being violent towards me. And this was where I was beginning to wake up and think, actually, is this right or is this wrong? And I remember justifying it by saying, but Andrew, this is the south of France. It's 42 degrees today. Of course, there were many partners. You can't count that. Can't count that as an attack. It's too hot. Can't count that. And so that's how the narrative bias can work in that instance. And of course, it affects us in all areas of our life. So I think part of why I wanted it to work out, yes, of course, it was my daughters. And that broke my heart, not being able to live with them on a daily basis again. And I suspected that there could be some difficulties in the family courts. And you're playing this, treading on eggshells as a dad, just trying to keep the peace at all costs so that the contact isn't messed about. But some of it, like I say, was what was in me of not wanting to give up. And now, of course, I have a much healthier relationship with perseverance. And I talk about pulling the plug rather than giving up. Sometimes you need to let out the soapy, lukewarm water and let in the hot, clean water if you want a nice, clean bath. And there's nothing wrong with pulling the plug. I think the words quitting and never and sort of giving up, they don't have helpful connotations. So when I'm talking to my kids, we talk about changing direction, pulling the plug, which is a better way of approaching that question of where I'm just going to actually take my energy and put it somewhere else. That's really what you're doing. You're not giving up the violin if you're then going to go and do something different. You might be stopping practicing the violin so you can start doing something else.
So just to give some context, how long ago was all this, Andrew?
Well, and it's the reason why I can talk freely about it now for two reasons. One, emotionally, I can talk freely about it. And two, because my daughters are the age that they're at now, there's no family court nonsense. So it's why I didn't talk about it before, and I do talk about it now. So it happened, I was in that relationship from 1998 through till 2009. That was the official divorce. We split in 2007. The divorce came through in 2009. So married, sort of together, I suppose, 8 or 9 years. And then sort of in that breakup, getting the divorce sorted for about a year, which isn't unusual. So that's kind of the context. And I'd always wondered whether I would talk about it. But then family court stuff kicked off, as it always does for where you have an abusive person and then there's kids involved and a divorce involved, you're going to have trouble. You're just going to have trouble. You can't cooperate. You can't co-parent. You can't reason with an abusive person. And I would just, make the point, I know plenty of women who have a terrible time at the family courts because they are trying to sort things out with an abusive man. And I know guys who've had a terrible time at the family courts too. So I think, at the family courts, I mean, that's another podcast, about the complexities, about the inadequacies of the family court system. There are good people, good mums and dads who just get ruined by the family courts, financially ruined, emotionally ruined. And I've had some big battles that have been so draining. It's just, it's hard to even begin to describe how painful a process the family courts currently are. So that's another thing that we need to look at. We need to overhaul. We need to rethink how we work with people where there is domestic abuse. And what about allegations of domestic abuse? I mean, my now ex-wife, when we were going through the family courts, I didn't mention the domestic abuse because I hadn't secured a conviction. So why would I mention it? But my ex-wife requested a screening court, all full of all kinds of unsubstantiated allegations, which of course she knew she couldn't prove because, well, they didn't happen, but they're there, they're on the paperwork. I'm in a courtroom full of women and female barristers and a female judge. And so the request for a screen was a nonsense and was not granted. But what you've got in the family courts, because nobody gets punished for lying. If you knowingly lie in court and I can prove it, you won't get punished in a family court of law. There's no perjury or anything like that. So it means that abusive people will stoop as low as they have to get their own way because they can. And so it means that the family courts are incredibly messy. The independent organizations that advise the judges don't have much time to look at each case. So it's more of a box ticking exercise and it is very random and it's a bit of a lottery. So when people ring me, often guys in the family court system, they've come out of the abusive relationship, can I help them? Well, the only help I can offer is get a good lawyer that's very local to the courthouse. They at least know the system. And after that, it's a lottery. So start praying.
Well, I think you've illustrated exactly why there's so much underreporting going on, because the actual resolutions are tough and going forward, and hearing what you've shared and saying that it has shaped you into the person that you now are. And I guess in some respects you wouldn't change any of that because of who you are now and what you're doing.
No, I wouldn't. And I absolutely wouldn't. And also, I'm happy. Once you start getting into changing history, then I might not have met my wife, who's just brilliant, and I wouldn't have had my daughters. And so I'm not one to get into trying to alter history. History's happened. There's a lot of good that's come from it, and the really tough things. And I think there doesn't always have to be a reason for everything that's ever happened in the world. Sometimes just bad stuff happens. And there's no particular meaning, there's no particular lesson, and you just have to write it off as a bad thing, a bad experience. And maybe the only good thing is that it helps you to appreciate the really good stuff, and that's all that can be taken from it. But if that is, then move on. And there was a time, when I first came out of the abusive relationship, and I was determined in all future romantic liaisons that if ever got serious, there would be a prenup. I was not going to be messed around. I would absolutely ensure that any future wife would sign a prenup. And I was quite bitter, I suppose. But then I've got lovely sisters. I've got a lovely mum. I had, although they weren't the ones long term, I met a couple of really nice women who were wonderful and lovely. We dated. It didn't work out. And I just why am I being so bitter? The only person that's going to, I'm going to end up hurting other people and being a mess myself. And so it was nice to I don't know what point it was now looking back, where I just thought, all the stuff that's happened, it's gone, let's move on. Just because one person was abusive, most people, and I believe this, are actually all right. Most people are all right. And then you get a few bad uns, and usually they've got a whole load of stuff that's making them a bit rotten. And it might not be for you to support them, it might be for someone else, but most people are good, and I think we have to work with that as our mantra.
So with that in mind, and with the 4 hats that you're currently wearing, what's coming up next?
Oh, blind, what is coming up next? I've got a busy few months on all fronts. Always busy with the kids. Is just the kids, just constantly growing up and testing and trying to push the boundaries, but having lots of fun as well. I think, do you know what? I tell you what, the most exciting thing I've got coming up, actually. So I'm doing some work with Kafkas later this year. So I've got leadership stuff coming up. I'm doing sort of webinars and online events, like I say, for the FSB, IOD, and various associations, institutions, and that's all great. It's really, it's more than great. It's a privilege, and it's lots of fun. The stuff I do with the charity is great. Seeing the community centre taking off, I'm sort of taking a lead on some of the money mentoring stuff there, because local debt's a huge problem. But actually, later this year, the event with Kafkas will be absolutely, I can't wait to do that. So because of my experiences in the family courts and my experiences with domestic violence, I'm doing some work with their senior management teams around domestic violence, parental alienation, and what is it like going through the family courts at the moment. And what a privilege to be able to do that training. I can't wait to do that. And they're an organization I've always wanted to work with, because Kafkas, do you know who Kafkas are?
No.
Sorry, so Kafkas, they are the independent social workers that work in the family courts, and they advise the judges what to do. So sometimes the judges won't always do what Kafkas says, but generally they do. So if Kafkas think that you're the problem as a mum because you're not letting blokey see kids, then you've got a real problem. The blokey will see kids if that's what they have. A lot of power in the family courts, and unfortunately for Kafkas, they have a lot of very good caseworkers and a lot of caseworkers who are perhaps not quite so competent, and they get a really bad press generally, because they're always going to upset someone, whatever they decide to do. So being able to work with them, being able to do some training with them, and sharing of kind of my experience in the family courts, which are very mixed. I've got very mixed experiences of Kafkas. Being able to constructively work through how how to improve their offering and what they do is an amazing privilege. It is the thing I'm most excited about doing later this year.
That sounds wonderful, and it sounds like the opportunity for you to voice your experiences and to have some effect there in changing things and in changing the way that people are filtering the information that they're receiving and potentially making the wrong decisions, not necessarily the wrong decisions, but making uninformed decisions.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and trying to, exactly that, and I think. The whole aspect of parental alienation, where is a hugely divisive subject, where different lobbying groups, there's just such a refusal to accept anybody else's opinion. And so my view on parental alienation is it's quite blurred, it's quite grey. It's a very complicated issue. I've fought in court as someone that was alienated from my daughters. I then won custody of my daughters. I was then back in the courts being accused of parental alienation, of which it took. I thought it'd be a breeze to disprove, but it was actually a lot harder than I thought it would be. And there are some parents who deliberately try and squeeze the other parent out of the child's life by colouring that child's view, by messing around contact. There are some parents that do that deliberately, but it's through ignorance and they can be coached. Some parents do it deliberately and can't be coached. And some parents, and this is the situation I found myself in, you end up being put in so many awkward and difficult positions that parenting neutrally becomes almost impossible. And so you might get your knuckles rapped at court for not parenting neutrally, but you put the situation in front of the court and say, what would you have done? And they won't have any answers, but they'll continue to rap your knuckles. And so I'm quite passionate that this whole area of parental alienation, that we understand the complexities behind it, because there are some really good parents out there who are in impossible situations where they have to try and parent neutrally somehow.
Yeah, there's no guidebook for this, is there? It's one of those ways of living that you just have to do your best with the tools you have at the time, but essentially if you've got someone like you who's championing for change to be made and make it a lot easier, then it's your voice that's going to get heard. So that's fantastic, which is why you are speaking on these topics.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's a great pleasure, and thank you for having me on your podcast as well.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure to explore this, Andrew. How would people get in contact with you? They've heard what you've had to say and they want to speak to you.
Well, if they want to speak to me, just come via my website, www.andrewpain.co.uk. Remember that pain is spelled P-A-I-N, as in pain in the neck. And so that's probably the best way. You can find me on LinkedIn. There aren't too many Andrew Pains with that spelling of pain. P-A-I-N. Anybody that wants to find out more about domestic violence, sort of kind of gender unity, male struggle, I've got my TEDx talk on YouTube. If they just type in Andrew Pain TEDx, that will come up. There's a 12-minute talk on domestic violence. But yeah, if you want to get in contact, come through the website. There's a way that you can book a call if you want to and find out more.
Perfect. Well, all of those links will go into the show notes, particularly the TEDx, because it's well worth watching and to get an understanding of probably a more in-depth version of what we've talked about here. So, yeah. Thank you, Andrew. It's been an absolute privilege. Do you have some final words for the audience?
I think probably the words I would have for the audience is, and I know it's really straightforward on the one hand, but just make sure you are checking in with those around you. Are they really okay? Because at the moment, life is really tough. And I know from my own perspective as well, when you yourself are just trying to survive, your head can go down. You can look very inwardly and be very focused on self and self-care, which of course is important. But just that kind of reaching out to people is just so important at the moment, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's a guy across the road who you think's a bit weird anyway, or whether it's just whatever it is, just that we are trying to reach out to people. We're trying to be kind to people in the workplace. I think more than ever, we've got to try to look out for each other and open up conversations about how are people actually doing.
Thank you for listening to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star Apple Podcast review. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook, and become a member of my inspiring, uplifting and positive Focus on Why Facebook group. I help people to focus on their why with clarity, uniting their passion with their purpose with a plan to create the life they truly desire. If you would like me to help you focus on your why, then please book a free 20-minute coaching call via calendly.com/Amy Rowlandson. And if you haven't already, please sign up for the Friday Focus weekly newsletter via my website, amyrowlandson.com. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.